They told you the Black Death ended in 1353, that it swept through Europe like a storm, took its dead, and vanished. That's the version written in textbooks. Sanitized, contained, forgotten. But what if I told you that's a lie? Before start this story, please like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon. That the Black Death never ended, that its true horror was never microbial, but metaphysical. A spiritual infection buried so deep in the veins of civilization that it still pulses beneath your skin. The first sign wasn't the rats. It wasn't the boils. It was the silence. A silence that fell across whole towns in France and Germany where not a single scream was heard. Just the wind and the sudden absence of birds. Corpses weren't the beginning. They were the consequence. Something ancient had been disturbed, not just disease. Something older than sickness. Something that watched the world for 1,000 years before opening its mouth. The first to die weren't the weakest. They were the witnesses. Priests who knew too much. Doctors who found something they weren't supposed to find. Entire monasteries went silent because they were never meant to interpret what they had uncovered. You've been taught the plague was a bacteria. But where then are the records of those who survived but changed? Eyes darkened, teeth blackened, dreams invaded by endless fields of screaming. Children who forgot their parents, men who forgot their names. Entire villages that re-emerged not as survivors, but as something else entirely. What if the Black Death wasn't a disease, but a ritual? A mass initiation, a purge by fire, or something colder? You were never meant to dig this deep, but now you're here. You pressed play. You can't unknow what follows. Because the dead don't always stay in the ground, and what the plague carried wasn't death. It was a message. They called it God's punishment, but no God would orchestrate such silence. Not even wrath sounds like this. The truth is, it wasn't heaven that sent the plague. It was something far beneath. Before the first wave of death swept Europe, there were whispers, monks vanishing from locked cells, entire underground crypts unearthed and emptied, and sacred texts rewritten in ink that bled through the parchment centuries later. The Vatican buried the original plague chronicles beneath lead-sealed vaults, claiming heresy. But those scrolls spoke not of disease, but of a calling. One line repeated again and again. The veil thinned. What veil? Between what and what? Survivors reported visions, faceless figures in the mist, dragging chains across cobblestone, voices that bled into the walls, and children who spoke ancient languages in their sleep. One merchant from Venice returned home untouched by sickness, but with his skin permanently cold and damp, as if embalmed. He never blinked again. His wife slit his throat a week later. She claimed his blood ran black and smelled of sulfur. Records sealed it as a domestic tragedy. But if you look closely at the margins of that report, if you magnify the ink, there are sigils burned into the paper not by hand, but by presence. You were told the plague burned itself out. No, it burned its way in, through Europe, through thought, through lineage. Those with the mark passed it down not through flesh, but through knowledge. Families erased from memory because they remembered too well. And now, after centuries of slumber, something is awakening again. Look at the modern world. The apathy, the sleepwalking, the strange dreams, the unexplained suicides of historians, archivists, grave diggers. Do you really think that's coincidence? The Black Death never ended. It only changed form. And it's watching again. Every city built atop plague ground, every hospital with foundations on medieval mass graves. It's listening. It remembers who stared into the veil and who tried to tell the world. Those people? They never died. They were taken. And pieces of them are still here, in old texts, in forgotten catacombs, and sometimes, if you're very quiet, in the corner of your bedroom, when you think you're alone. You think the plague was a medical event, but medicine was never its enemy. It was its carrier. The physicians who wore beaked masks filled with herbs, they weren't just avoiding disease. They were disguising themselves from something that could see through flesh, something that hunted by memory and intention. Those masks were copied from older designs, Egyptian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and always linked to rites of the dead. The herbs stuffed inside weren't cures. They were offerings, sacrifices. The first plague doctors didn't heal. They recorded. Their journals were filled with drawings of impossible anatomy, organs rearranged into symbols, victims whose skeletons were hollowed out and filled with ash. But even those journals were later edited, redacted, destroyed. Why? Because something was spreading beyond infection, something in the architecture of reality itself. Entire cities like Tournai and Siena experienced time distortion, clocks spinning backwards, days lost, voices echoing from future hours. Survivors spoke in tongues. Others forgot their own names, but could recount the final screams of strangers miles away. This wasn't just death. It was recalibration. Entire villages vanished not due to pestilence, but because they were erased, pulled from the ledger of the living by something that fed on forgotten lineage. You've never heard of the hollow parish of Brottenburg, have you? Exactly. It existed. Then it didn't. One day, 2,000 people. The next, black soil, melted stone, and a single church bell still ringing. Nothing remained, except one survivor found naked and mute, her tongue carved with the symbol of the plague cross inverted. She never spoke again, but she drew. Always the same image, a spiral staircase leading underground, each step made of skulls, and at the bottom, an open book that bled. This was never about rats. It was about reckoning. What if the plague, hasn't sent to kill but to catalog? What if you're being watched even now, not through your screen but through your remembering? You're being pulled into it because that's how it works. It doesn't attack the body first. It whispers to the parts of you that question, that remember, that awaken. And now, it sees you. They say history repeats itself, but only if you survive it the first time. And what if you didn't? What if the version of you walking now is just what was left behind? A fragment patched together by old whispers that rode the Black Death like a chariot. In 1348, reports surfaced from the outer edges of Bohemia, not of plague, but of people who stopped casting shadows. Entire households still alive, still speaking, but somehow wrong. One priest wrote, "They mirror the living, but reflect no soul." When investigators arrived, they found empty homes with meals still warm, chairs overturned, doors locked from the inside. But no bodies, only stains, on the walls, in the shape of hands reaching upward. These stains couldn't be scrubbed, couldn't be painted over, couldn't be explained. The Black Death did not just kill, it collected, took what it wanted, and left behind replicas. You think you would notice, but would you? The replica knows your name. It bleeds, it loves, but it dreams in echoes, and under moonlight it stands too still. That's why those infected weren't always burned. Sometimes they were buried alive, not out of cruelty, but fear. Not everyone who recovered came back fully human. The Archbishop of Mainz ordered entire convents sealed from within after a dozen nuns survived the plague, but began speaking with identical voices, predicting the deaths of nearby bishops days before they occurred. Their final act? They scratched the same message into their cell walls before falling silent. It wasn't the death. It was the door. Scholars would later debate the meaning, but you already feel it, don't you? That something was let in, and it didn't leave. The Black Death was a thinning, a breach. And in some places, like forgotten catacombs, plague pits under modern subway systems, and churches no longer consecrated, the veil still trembles. You can hear it if you listen long, G enough to static, the old chanting, the same 5 notes, the call that brought the sickness, or the sickness that responded to the call. The truth is, some of us were marked long ago, not cursed, chosen. For what? We're about to find out. But first, say it aloud. Twice. Write it below. The veil thinned. Again. The veil thinned. You are not who you were. And the plague remembers. The plague didn't just arrive, it was summoned. You think it spread randomly? No, it followed patterns. Sacred geometry hidden in trade routes, ley lines disguised as roads. Cities that fell first, Florence, Paris, London, were all aligned along a forgotten arcane path once used by the Roman augurs, the same priests who mapped omens in the guts of the dead. But during the Black Death, the guts no longer revealed futures. They told truths. One Florentine doctor wrote that upon dissecting a plague victim, he found a perfectly intact parchment folded inside the stomach, not digested, placed. It was written in reverse Latin, and when translated read, "Feed the dead their name, or be devoured by memory." He burned the scroll. 3 days later, his entire household choked to death on air that had turned to ash. This wasn't coincidence. This was consequence. Because there are names that, once remembered, awaken. And that's what the plague was. A ritual of remembrance, a summoning by mass suffering, a prayer screamed through decaying throats until something answered. Something old, something patient. It didn't want land or gold, it wanted entry. The suffering was a price, and enough was paid. Monasteries began collapsing not from disease, but from sound, low hums at night that grew into choruses of unseen voices echoing from inside the walls. One monk in Chartres was found with his ears sealed shut by bone. His final words carved into the wood of his cot. We opened it. We opened it with our fear. The Black Death was never about cleansing the earth. It was about weakening the seal between us and it. You felt it, haven't you? In dreams that smell like mold, in old books that seem to whisper as you close them, in the silence after midnight, when your thoughts are not quite yours. That's not paranoia, that's memory. The plague didn't die out. It passed the torch, and you, yes, you are next in line. Don't run. It doesn't follow speed, it follows attention, so look away now, or it'll know you're ready. In 1351, when the plague had supposedly begun to wane, a strange phenomenon occurred across several quarantine towns in Bavaria. Bells rang without ropes. Every midnight for 13 nights, the churches echoed with phantom chimes, even though the bell towers were sealed and the ropes had been burned to prevent gatherings. Witnesses reported the air turning metallic, their breath slowing, as if something beyond gravity had taken hold of time itself. A shepherd outside Nuremberg claimed the bells weren't ringing to summon the living, but to wake the buried. And he wasn't wrong. In a valley nearby, 37 freshly dug graves cracked open from below. Not dug, but torn. The corpses were missing, not stolen, but absent, the dirt compressed inward, as though something had pulled them down. This was no longer a plague. It was an extraction. Records from a local monastery describe a secret order known only as Custodes Inferni, the keepers of the lower gate. They didn't fight the plague. They facilitated it, their sacred duty, to guide what had been summoned into its proper vessel. That vessel wasn't a person. It was the earth itself. They buried the infected, not to protect the living, but to feed the threshold. The more bodies, the thinner the veil. a ritual disguised as mercy. Even stranger were the children, those born during the plague who never blinked. They spoke in riddles before they could crawl. Some drew maps in ash, spirals, tunnels, doors. One map matched the underground layout of an abandoned Roman temple no living soul had seen in over 1,000 years. When asked how they knew, they said, "We are the bells now." Then they smiled, every one of them in unison. The Black Death didn't simply kill, it recruited. And the ones it chose didn't die. They changed. They walked the earth unnoticed, guiding events, spreading silence like a contagion of forgetting. You pass them on trains, in crowds, in hospitals. They are calm, too calm, because they've heard the bells, and soon, so will you. In a crumbling village near Bruges, a priest named Father Anselm broke his silence in the winter of 1352. He'd survived the plague, but not untouched. Every night he dreamed of catacombs he had never seen, narrow, pulsating with the sound of dripping liquid that was not water. When he awoke, his fingers were blackened at the tips, as if he had been touching something ancient, buried and burning. He began to write feverishly, transcribing these dreams in a language no scholar could identify. Not Latin, not Greek, something older. One scholar claimed it resembled Proto-Sumerian, but backward. Anselm wrote until his fingers broke. Then he dictated. When the church sent envoys to silence him, they found his chapel desecrated, crucifixes melted, pews shattered inward. On the altar sat a single item, his tongue nailed to parchment, still twitching. What he wrote became known as the Throat Book, not because of its content, but because every copy kills the reader by choking, not all at once, slowly, paragraph by paragraph. One bishop lasted until page 74 before vomiting blood shaped like letters. The text wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be heard. In fact, that's how the plague began to spread in this region, not by rats or fleas, but by whispers. Travelers would arrive healthy and die within a week, gasping words they didn't understand but couldn't stop repeating. Open the deep door, let the still speak. This wasn't illness, this was invocation. And the Black Death was just its choir practice. Father Anselm's last message was not written, but etched into his own ribs. The song has teeth, you must not echo it. But it's already too late. You're not just hearing this, you're absorbing it. These words are scaffolding. You're the cathedral, and something is building itself inside you. By 1353, the Vatican itself could no longer pretend the plague was a test of faith. Secret conclaves were held, not to pray, but to negotiate. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in chambers forbidden to even the cardinals, a select few gathered with documents bound in skin, not metaphorical parchment, human. They spoke of the inheritance, a cycle that reactivates every 33 years, when death isn't a punishment, but an opening. The Black Death, they claimed, was not a curse, it was a summons, and Europe had answered. One inquisitor, Cardinal Bellator, insisted the infected weren't victims, but keys. He referenced a manuscript called Liber Cineris, the Book of Ash, a tome that mapped where the world thins. When he opened it during the meeting, the candles didn't flicker, they froze. Smoke curled downward, and every man present bled from the ears, except him. When they tried to remove the book, it disintegrated, but not into dust, into whispers. The air spoke, and one scribe dropped dead. His shadow burnt into the marble like a reverse scorch mark. The survivors buried the event. Literally. They entombed the chamber in lead, poured holy oil, and bricked over the entrance. But one man didn't leave. Bellator stayed. He said, "If you silence the gate silences you." He was never seen again, until 1686. When excavators uncovered a sealed tomb beneath the Vatican, bearing no name, only an engraving. a man with a split mouth and 7 tongues. Inside was Bellator's corpse, untouched by time, skin soft, eyes open, and in his mouth a rolled parchment, the missing pages of Liber Cineris. They described a reverse exorcism, not forcing something out, but inviting it in, not possession, volunteering, and worse. The ritual began with listening, which means if you've heard this far, you've already taken the first step. The whispers didn't die with the Vatican's silence. Instead, they drifted like smoke without fire, seeping into places where memory runs thin. One of those places was a nameless hospice in Bohemia, a place forgotten by time but remembered by death. It was built in 1349, supposedly as a quarantine zone, but there are no burial records, only intake logs, and every name ends with a slash, like a throat. Survivors spoke of nights filled not with coughing, but chanting, from rooms that no longer had doors. Nurses began drawing circles in chalk, not to heal, but to contain. When one nun tried to leave, she walked 14 miles and ended up back at the same gate, her footprints following behind her, fresh. They say the patients weren't suffering. They were rehearsing, speaking in tandem, eyes white, blood leaking not from their mouths, but their ears and navels. A priest was called to bless the place. When he sprinkled holy water, it evaporated mid-air, and his skin cracked like dry bark. He died pronouncing a word that had no vowels. The hospice was eventually walled off and erased from maps, renamed as forest, as if trees could smother truth. But in the dead of winter, hikers still find it, always at dusk, always alone, and always hearing the same thing. Laughter, not the kind from joy, the kind that precedes tearing. One man recorded it in 1962. That reel was played once, on live radio. 11 listeners were hospitalized, 2 never woke up. The tape was burned. But ash doesn't forget, especially not when it was never made from fire, but from language. That hospice wasn't a hospital. It was a choir school for something inhuman, something preparing to speak through us. They tell us the plague ended, that Europe recovered, rebuilt, rebirthed itself in art and science. But that's not what the bones say. Beneath Munich, archaeologists unearthed a crypt in 1977, sealed in copper and lead. Inside were 26 skeletons, sitting upright, arms crossed, skulls facing a single wall. On that wall, no cross, no name, just a relief carving of a man missing his face, with hands stitched into the shape of a book. Tests dated the remains to 1351, but the carbon readings were inverted, suggesting not age, but something future-bound, as if they'd never decayed. Each skeleton had its jaw wired open, and inside each mouth, a blackened stone etched with reversed Latin. When read backward, the stones translated into, "We heard, we answered, we fed." The team of 7 scientists who opened the tomb vanished within weeks. 2 suicides, 1 institutionalized, and the rest simply gone. The university buried the findings, but one assistant kept a journal. She wrote, "This wasn't a mass grave. This was a council. These people weren't hiding from death. They were calling it." She died in her sleep days later, her mouth full of dirt and her vocal cords missing. Locals now avoid the excavation site, even though it's covered in concrete. Birds refuse to fly over it. GPS loses signal. And on certain nights, if you knock 3 times on the slab at precisely 3:33 a.m., you'll hear it knock back, not from below, but from behind your eyes, because the Black Death didn't kill its victims, it recruited them. Not the end of life, but the start of a language of death now fluent in silence. By 1353, the plague had passed, but in the French village of Saint-Aveugle, no such relief came. The town was erased from royal census rolls, not because it perished, but because it continued. Travelers who approached it reported an overwhelming stench of copper and ink and a low thrumming beneath the soil. Those who ventured further described a town where time seemed unfastened, the sun rising in reverse, shadows moving before their source. The people, pale and wordless, wandered in perfect patterns, circling the stone fountain at the center of town, not begging, not praying, repeating. One letter, now held under lock in the Vatican's secret archives, describes how a bishop entered the town and attempted to baptize the well water. It hissed, turned black, boiled his hand to the bone. Days later, a drawing arrived at the Abbey of Tours, a faceless nun with her eyes sewn open, holding a scroll that read, "We do not forget, we do not rot, we are writing the end backward." That scroll was never translated fully. Every attempt led to sudden illness, seizures, and a recurring hallucination. A cathedral inverted, built into the sky, not the earth. It said Santa Vogla was not a village. It was a monastery without monks, a place where the plague wrote its own scripture through human vessels, inscribing terror into muscle and blood, building not a religion, but a rehearsal for extinction. Today, satellite images show nothing but trees where it once stood, yet drones drop from the sky attempting to scan it. The soil reads as bone-rich, but no graves have ever been found, because the dead stood up and the living sat down. England's recovery from the plague was a myth told by kings. In truth, the crown funded the Order of the Quiet, a secret brotherhood of plague scribes stationed beneath Salisbury Cathedral. Their task? To chronicle the behavior of the dead, not in burial, but in movement. Hidden in the crypts beneath the altar lies a chamber known only as the Gallery of Remaining. Stone beds, shackled limbs, and parchment, miles of parchment, covered in scrawl that no modern scholar has deciphered. The language curves unnaturally, spiraling inward like a labyrinth made of ink. These weren't reports. They were instructions. Survivors nearby whispered that sometimes the bells would ring at night, even when no one pulled them. And when they did, you were not to answer your door, for it wasn't knocking you'd hear, it was coughing, inside out, backward, like lungs remembering breath. One friar's account, found sealed in wax, reads, "They do not decompose, they arrange. Every night they sit closer. Every morning I wake to more ink under my fingernails. I no longer write, yet the scrolls multiply." The last official record of the order is dated 1377, then nothing. Gone, not disbanded, absorbed. When Salisbury's foundation was renovated in 1935, workers reported digging into a void, where sound was deadened, torches flickered cold blue, and writing bled down the walls. They filled it with quicklime and silence, yet once a year, during the Lenten moon, the cathedral lights flicker for exactly 44 seconds. And those who look down into the nave swear they see people seated in the pews, motionless, cloaked, but not casting shadows. Not echoes, just waiting. Because the dead of the plague didn't seek heaven. They built their own. In the northern hills of Lombardy, near Lake Como, lies a forest that no cartographer dares chart. Bosco del Silencio, the silent wood. After the Black Death receded, survivors reported a foul mist crawling through the trees at dusk, humming with a strange, hollow resonance. Shepherds spoke of bone birds that nested in the boughs, their cries resembling human groans. But it was what was found beneath the roots that stilled the region's voice for generations. In 1360, a group of Benedictine monks digging for timber uncovered a network of plague crypts, chambers packed not with corpses, but with masks. Thousands, all identical, wooden, pale, eyeless, and mouthless, each carved with the same phrase on the inside lip, "We listened too long." No one knows who made them or why. When several monks donned the masks for safekeeping, they fell into a trance. For days they stood in rows, unmoving, until one by one they began to whisper backward, speaking Latin in reverse and naming dates that hadn't come yet. One monk, Brother Alaric, took a dagger to his chest and carved the word repeat into his rib cage before succumbing. The Vatican declared the site cursed and sealed it with molten lead. But even now, hikers go missing near the tree line, and those who return speak of chanting in the soil. They describe long shadows cast by nothing and a wind that breathes with purpose. Plague didn't just kill, it seeded memory. And in this forest, that memory still grows teeth. Venice, 1371. A city already steeped in whispers of disease and damnation found itself choking on something worse than rot. Remembrance. Beneath the Basilica di San Marco, workers renovating the crypt unearthed what they believed to be a sealed ossuary. But inside were no bones, only chairs, arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward, with heavy iron nails driven into the floor beneath each. Sitting atop each chair was a plague doctor's mask, beaked, brittle with age, and sealed shut from the inside. The leather bindings were not sewn but fused, as if by unnatural heat. Etched into the backs of the chairs were dates stretching across centuries, some yet to arrive. One chair, inexplicably warm to the touch, bore today's date. It was immediately removed and thrown into the Grand Canal. But that night, the water boiled beneath the moonlight, and a thin trail of black feathers was found drifting to shore. The Venetian Senate quietly ordered the crypt resealed, but records show that each doge since then has received a private letter, sealed in wax, with a symbol resembling a plague mask's eye. The contents are unknown, but each doge has been seen trembling upon reading it. Some claim the masks still speak to each other in low, muffled wheezes during eclipses. And once every year, a gondolier vanishes, leaving behind only a paddle carved with a single word: witness. Whatever was buried under Venice wasn't meant to be forgotten. It was meant to remember us, long after we vanished. In the shattered outskirts of what was once Würzburg, Germany, the plague left behind more than corpses. It left behind choirs of silence. In 1375, a manuscript known only as Der Schweigende Codex, the Silent Codex, was discovered in a hollowed-out brick behind the altar of a ruined chapel. Written in iron gall ink that never fades, the book contained 366 psalms, all of them blank. No text, no notation. Only indentations in the vellum, like words erased by fire, yet never written. Monks who handled it reported hearing choir music inside their teeth, a dissonant harmony that continued long after they had left the room. One monk, Brother Klausner, locked himself in the chapel for 3 days with the codex. When the door was forced open, he was kneeling, eyes sewn shut, humming a 4-note chant on repeat, the exact pattern now used in European ambulance sirens. When physicians tried to cut the stitches, they found no thread, just flesh fused to flesh. The chapel was burned, yet the codex reappeared decades later in Prague, then Krakow, then Ghent, always just after a new outbreak. Scholars now believe the silent codex wasn't written for reading, but for broadcasting, a score to a symphony played by death itself. And wherever it travels, the music follows. Some say modern sirens are its echo, a warning to those who think the plague is gone. But the codex never left. It just waits for the next note. In the frostbitten corridors of Uppsala's oldest university, sealed beneath layers of time and bureaucratic forgetting, lies a chamber that no one dares catalogue, the room without measurements. Discovered in 1380 by plague physicians granted access to church catacombs for academic preservation, this room reportedly had no consistent dimensions. Walls shifted, sometimes inward, sometimes outward. What was 10 paces long in the morning became 2 paces by dusk. The floor groaned as if it inhaled, and compasses spun erratically inside. But the most terrifying feature was the single item at its center, a bronze cradle, empty, pristine, and untouched by dust. Not even cobwebs dared cling to it. On the cradle's rim was a Latin inscription, Dormit qui moritur, he who dies, sleeps. One professor attempted to sleep beside it for observation. By morning he was catatonic, lips twitching as if repeating a lullaby that no one else could hear. He died with his eyes wide open, pupils dilated in terror. Students still whisper that those who study plague theory too closely begin dreaming of the cradle, always from above, always descending toward it, as if from a mother's arms. Some claim the cradle is not empty, but simply awaits recognition. Whatever child it once held, or still holds, might be older than death itself. And when the Black Death surged, perhaps it wasn't a curse, but a rocking,